Greetings from American Exception. I'm Aaron Good, and today I'm talking with Robert Kennedy Jr. He's running for president in 2024. RFK Jr. is trying to deal with corporate media malfeasance, in part by speaking with an array of independent voices, which I'm happy to say today includes American Exception. Special thanks to David Talbot for facilitating this. At this point, I see American democracy as having become totally overwhelmed by American anti-democracy, the oligarchy of corporate wealth. But even with that in mind, imagine Joe Biden trying to comment on the issues we're about to discuss here, like world peace and the future of post-hegemonic USA. Robert Kennedy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
So I have a preface here for this question that I think is worth it. So I hope that you'll agree, and it deals with the question of peace. So I'm just going to go with it now. On November 29th, 1963, your father and your aunt Jackie Kennedy sent a secret message to the Soviets through William Walton. The Soviet Georgy Bolshakov had been a back channel to the Kremlin for JFK. William Walton told Bolshakov that Robert and Jackie Kennedy knew that the Soviets were not behind the guns in Dallas and that it was a domestic right-wing conspiracy. They also warned that LBJ would not continue JFK's policies because he was too close to big business, and so the quest for peace would have to wait until Robert Kennedy could get to the White House. Of course, we know what happened, or today we know enough of what happened, but I have to ask, is it finally time to resume the quest for peace?
I would say yes for that.
What does it say that this is not something that politicians say anymore? I mean, when Barack Obama won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2008, he said, we better get used to the idea that war is always going to be with us. But your uncle had a different vision. He said, we can't think that way. It's self-defeating to think that peace is impossible. So how do you plan to go against these trends of recent decades, and it's many decades now, where peace is not even on the table? How do you plan to make this happen?
When my uncle took office in January of 1961, and I was at his inauguration 3 days before he took office on January 17th. The outgoing president, Dwight Eisenhower, gave a speech that is probably one of the most, today, in retrospect, one of the most important speeches in American history, where he warned Americans against the emergence of a military-industrial complex that would devour our democracy, that would turn us into an imperial state abroad and a surveillance state at home, and that it would corrode our democratic institutions. And my uncle, 2 months after he came into office in March of 1961, he had been meeting for 2 months with his Joint Chiefs of Staff and his CIA advisors, including Alan Dulles, Charles Cabal, and Richard Bissell, who were trying to get him to support the Bay of Pigs invasion by 2,000 Cuban refugees who had armed themselves and were trained by the CIA in Guatemala and Texas and Louisiana and camps in Florida. And they wanted to return to their homeland and depose Fidel Castro. And my uncle said he did not want to have the U.S. military support that because it was an independent country and it would be inconsistent with American values to begin a preemptive war against somebody who had not done anything to the United States that was warlike, that should provoke a war. And that no matter how much distaste we had for Castro's choices in governing his country, those decisions were up to Cuba and the Cuban people, and were not, were not the province of the United States. And he refused to give the U.S. military support. they wanted amphibious vehicles and transportation, ships from the U.S. military to bring the Cuban brigade to the Bay of Pigs, and um, and instead they went to the corporations. They went to United Fruit, and the CIA got the United Fruit Company to transport, which of course had huge interest in the sugar plantations in Cuba, to transport the ships. But my uncle was skeptical. He was reluctant to give any U.S. support, and Dulles and Louis Lemonster and the Cabell and Richard Bissell said, we've armed these people. We can't. There's nothing else we can do with them. They'd actually be dangerous if we kept them in the United States. And he said, my uncle's attitude was, the French had supported us during the U.S. Revolution, and that we could give support to revolutionary groups in other countries, but we couldn't fight the war for them, and we shouldn't do anything that looked like a U.S. invasion. But and they lied to him, and they said that as soon as the Bay of Pigs Brigade landed, the Cuban people, that Castro was so unpopular, the Cuban people were going to rise up and throw him out of office. They just needed a spark to light this nascent revolution. And they knew at the time that was a lie. And they knew that Castro was actually immensely popular in Cuba at that time. And and my father later found this out because he sent two aides down who spent weekends over a year negotiating with Castro over the release of the Bay of Pigs prisoners. And they ended up going to baseball games with him and traveling around the country. And they told me, John Nolan, who's one of those two, told me that when they walked into a stadium and the people saw Castro, they would spontaneously rise and give him a prolonged standing ovation, and that it was clearly not orchestrated. It was people were fervent in that belief, but also he had a very well organized military, and he had an intelligence service that was, as good as any in the world, and so Dulles and the other CIA doyens knew they were lying to my uncle, and what they believed is that if they landed the brigade on the shore, and it was clear that they were about to be defeated, then my uncle would send in the Essex, which was the U.S. aircraft carrier, and give them air cover, and then the U.S. would be committed to getting rid of Castro. And my uncle later said this. He said they believed that a young president would collapse and send in the Essex and the military, and they misjudged me. During the height of that fight, when it was clear that the Cuban refugees, the brigade, was losing disastrously, he came out of his office and he said to one of his aides, I want to take the CIA, shatter it into 1,000 pieces, and scatter it to the winds. And he understood from that moment on. My grandfather, he looked at that as a catastrophe for his administration. And in fact, he said to his father, I think I should resign. And his father said, it's the best thing that could happen to you, because my grandfather, Joseph Kennedy, who was very skeptical of the military his entire life, he said, it's good that you learned who these guys were at the outset, and now you know. And my uncle, had fought in the war, World War II. He was a war hero, and he understood the brutality and the savagery of war. And he said to his best friend, one of his best friends, Ben Bradley, who was the publisher of the Washington Post, that the primary job of a president was to keep the country out of war. And when Bradley asked him, he said that because Bradley had asked him, what do you want on your gravestone? And my uncle said to him, he kept the peace. That's what he wanted his legacy to be. And, he succeeded despite tremendous pressure from his military advisors, from his intelligence apparatus, he succeeded in keeping the country out of war. he was pressured to send 250,000 combat troops to Vietnam. He refused steadfastly, despite Maxwell Taylor and Averell Harriman and all of his senior advisors, Dulles, etc., from who said you got to send them in. You got to send 250,000 troops, or the South Vietnamese government is going to collapse. He refused to do it. He ultimately sent 16,000 military advisors, mainly Green Berets, who were forbidden under the rules of engagement from engaging in combat. Now, a lot of them did engage in combat, but 2 weeks before he died, and incidentally, 16,000 troops is fewer troops than he sent to get one black man, James Meredith, into Ole Miss, into the University of Mississippi. He sent more troops there, federal troops there, and he did to Vietnam. And 2 weeks before he died, he signed a national security order ordering all those troops home. He had asked his aide that morning how many Americans had been killed in Vietnam, and his aide said 75, and he showed him the list of names. And my uncle said, "That's too much. I want them all home." And he signed an order that ordered them all home by the end of 1965, with the first 1,000 coming home the following month in November. So this is by December. And of course, he was killed on November 22nd. My father then, and then Johnson almost immediately reprimanded that order. And then the following year, during the Gulf of Tonkin crisis, which was, essentially just a made-up event that was used to justify the American entrance of the war, he did send 250,000. Ultimately, 500,000 troops went over there, Americans, and 57,000 died. We killed at least 1 million Vietnamese. But after that, it was an American war. It was exactly what my uncle had tried to avoid. My father in '68 ran against that war. And of course, he was killed during that campaign. So I think they understood exactly what what Eisenhower had warned, that if you allowed the military, if you allowed our country to persuade our people that we should be the policemen of the world, that the military-industrial complex would crush the middle class in this country with expenditures and basically turn America into a surveillance state, turn us against our democratic aspirations, and that indeed is exactly what happened. And we know the rest. We know 9/11. Then the Iraq War, which was, just made up, said in the same way the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, there was no justification for us making the first preemptive war in American history, going after somebody who had done nothing to our country, who had nothing to do with Al Qaeda, nothing to do with 9/11, but they just wanted to go. It was an oil war, and for all the reasons the neocons wanted a war. These frivolous reasons, and we spent $8.1 trillion in that war and its aftermath, which was the war in Yemen and Afghanistan and Syria, etc. We left Iraq worse off than we found it. We killed more Iraqis than Saddam Hussein. Iraq today is an incoherent nation where that just is a battle between Sunni and Shia death squads. We pushed Iraq into basically turned it into a proxy for Iran, which exactly was what we have been trying to prevent, during 40 years of diplomacy and military commitments. And we created ISIS. We drove 2 million refugees into Europe. We destabilized all the democracies in Europe. It probably was one of the things that led to Brexit. So all of the blowback from these wars, nobody ever accounts for. And, one of the biggest blowbacks, beside all the people that we've killed, the millions and millions of people unnecessarily, is that we've gutted, the expense of doing that has gutted the American middle class in this country. And we're now turning into, almost like a colonial model where there's these huge concentrations of wealth at the top, and then a widespread poverty below. And everybody knows, any social scientist and political scientist will tell you, you cannot have that kind of configuration and continue to have a functioning democracy. So we're destroying our democracy, we're destroying our middle class, and it's that's what Eisenhower, exactly what he had warned was going to happen.
Yes, and I'd say it goes back further than Eisenhower because, under FDR, which I think the New Deal administration was the most progressive in America in US history, but under FDR, the Council on Foreign Relations with this under the State Department imprimatur, but using Rockefeller Foundation money, so Standard Oil money, they carried out the War and Peace Studies Project, and this was planning to enter World War II and to win because the U.S. is the biggest industrial power, and then to become basically the manager of global capitalism and to go for global hegemony. This gets sold to the public by the Council on Foreign Relations media magnate. Council on Foreign Relations is basically Wall Street's think tank, but they're going to pitch this American empire idea with Henry Luce of Fortune and Time and Life magazine and his famous American Century essay. You had Henry Wallace, who opposed this and said that it should be a century of the common man, and the Soviets should adapt or learn from our political liberties, and that the US could learn from the Soviets when it comes to full employment and education and healthcare for the whole population. But Henry Wallace gets swept away and replaced as vice president through a coup, essentially led by an oil man. And the U.S. goes on to pursue empire after World War II, and the Cold War is, I would argue that it was in many ways a pretext for these plans, because if you don't have a Cold War, it's hard to imagine how you justify doing all these things. But I see Henry Wallace in a way similar to your uncle and your father, in that they tried to fight U.S. Steel, U.S. Steel Wall Street, really the biggest corporation at the time, the military brass, the CIA, the mafia, but all these groups is basically on the same side and part of the U.S. empire in different ways. So to me, they seem to have overcome people like Wallace and like your father and uncle, and they seem to collectively represent the heart of our U.S. capitalist system. Can U.S. democracy really overcome and transcend imperial capitalism, if I can use that phrase?
Well, I would differ with you over some of that, that interesting take on history, because I'm not, I know a lot of what you're saying is true, but there are other circumstances too. I mean, I would not blame World War II on Standard Oil and the Rockefellers. I'd blame it on Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. And you can go back before that and say that World War One was a conspiracy of bankers and industrialists. And I think that's
To clarify,
and that the World War One then laid the groundwork for the rise of Adolf Hitler.
right?
Once Hitler was out there, I don't see any that we
Oh,
had any choice except to try to stop him.
right. I'm not saying that that was the World War II was organized that way. I'm saying that in the U.S., these forces were assessing the situation and looking at what the U.S. should
Well,
do, and going for a bigger role for the U.S. in the world.
of course, those groups, are programmed to take advantage of crises and turn them into opportunities for imposing control and to de-democratize America. But it's I think Henry Wallace was, and I love Henry Wallace. I love to read his writings. He was not he was not a popular, very, very popular political figure at that time, and he wasn't he wasn't as adept at politics as FDR was, but FDR shared a lot of his idealism, and the Atlantic Charter, it was really a manifestation of that kind of wonderful side of FDR, where he basically dragooned Churchill into agreeing to release the British colonies in Africa and elsewhere in exchange for the U.S. entrance to the war. So he leveraged our assistance in the war to, for the cause of nationalism in the developing world. And so we didn't lose everything with Henry Wallace. We had a president who I think did not want our country to become an imperium. He was very different than his cousin, Teddy Roosevelt, who was the champion of kind of the imperial America. And my uncle was part of that FDR tradition. My uncle had been rescued when his boat, the PT-109, was cut in two by a Japanese destroyer in the middle of the night in the Blackett Straits off the Solomon Island. He swam 6 miles to an island with his crew members, and they were hiding out on the island. Well, they could watch the Japanese patrol boats looking for them, and they would have been in prison camps or been killed if they had been caught. And the two Solomon Islanders landed on that island, and my uncle to collect coconuts. And they were in a canoe, a dugout, and my uncle carved his coordinates and a note that said JPK, Captain Kennedy with us. I think it was 8 crew members or 9 crew members. And he put the coordinates down, and those two Solomon Islanders risked their own lives to bring that coconut in a big pile of coconuts in their boat 30 miles across the ocean to the British base to give it to the British commander. And my uncle's life was saved. And I think, that was part of his, the background of assumptions that he brought to office, that, it was a colonized population of, individual acting out of great courage who had saved his own life. And that those kind of people ought to be able to govern themselves. And when he took control of the subcommittee on African affairs in the United States Senate, he fought harder than anybody to get the European colonial powers out of Africa and out of the Mideast. I've run into so many people who bear my uncle's name, and people in the Arab countries who remember this famous speech he gave in 1956, where, all the liberals in our country condemned him. Adlai Stevenson condemned him because he said, Europeans need to get out. The Arabs should be running Arabia, and the Africans should be running Africa. It shouldn't be the European nations. And at that time, the European nations were limping along, and the only thing keeping them alive was the colonies that, if they could strip mine for their resources. And people in the United States, including the Republicans and Democrats, said we've got to bolster the European countries and continue to allow them to exploit their colonial possessions. And my uncle said, no, that's not the world that America should be fighting for. We were a colonial country. We should respect their aspirations also to be free, and we should support them, even if it puts us at odds with the Europeans. So he had that. I'll tell you a story. When I was a little kid, my father came home with a film called Africa Speaks. I think when I was 6 or 7 years old, my uncle was still in the White House. I was 7 years old, and we had a little, we had a screen in our basement that was kind of a portable movie screen, and he had a 16 millimeter movie, and he showed it to us, and I just became obsessed with Africa at that time. And I read every book that I could. I read all the Tarzan books. I read the Blue Nile, the White Nile, everything I could, all the picture books I could get on Africa, I got. And then in 19 well, I guess that was probably 59 or something. In 60, the summer of 1960, there was an African leader who came to our house in Hyannisport. His name was Tom Mboya. And he had been part of the Mau Mau in Kenya in the 50s. And the Mau Mau was a very violent revolution, anti-colonial revolution that was, kind of portrayed with horror for its savagery in the Western press. And he had been one of the people who had, with Jomo Kenyatta, who was one of the Kenyan leaders. And Mboya was unusual because he had gone to Oxford for a year. He was the only Kenyan at that time who had any kind of college education. And the Mau Mau succeeded ultimately, and the British agreed in 59 to hand Kenya back to the Kenyan people. But they said, look, we're going to give you 5 years and we're going to transition out, and you need to get yourself ready to govern yourself. And the boy at that time looked around and said, we don't have anybody who can govern this country. We don't have a single college graduate that is Black African. And so he sent letters. And by the way, Tom Mboya was from a little tribe, one of the smallest tribes in Kenya called the Luau, which are these fish-eating tribe from up near Lake Victoria. And they're known as kind of being super smart and peacemakers. Jomo Kenyatta was Kikuyu, which was the largest tribe in Kenya. And Mboya had sent letters to 200 American colleges asking them each to give a scholarship to one Kenyan student. And he would pick the 200 students, the best students in Kenya. And he got 200 American colleges to agree, including Harvard. And in the summer of 1960, they were supposed to come that autumn. And remember, this was during the election. He realized that he had the scholarships, but he didn't have money to transport the students to the United States. And so he flew to the United States and he went to the State Department to ask the State Department for help transporting these African students over. Well, at that time, Dick Nixon was vice president, was effectively running the State Department. And when the Secretary of State consulted him, he said, you better not do it, because I'm trying to win the southern states and I need to win southern whites. And if we bring 200 Africans over here, it's going to make people, nervous about me. And so Mboya then was really panicked, and he called up Martin Luther King, who he knew. And he said, where else can I get this money? I need $100,000. And Martin Luther King said, you should call the Kennedys. You should call John Kennedy, because he's on that African subcommittee and he really cares about African nationalism. And King was at that time being financed by Harry Belafonte, the famous calypso singer who died 2 weeks ago and who was very close to my family. And King knew that, King knew my family, but he wasn't, like a close personal friend, which Belafonte was. So he said to him, boy, I'm going to get Harry Belafonte to take you up to meet John Kennedy. And so Belafonte and Mboya came to our house in the summer of 1960, and I got to meet Tom Mboya. I was very excited to meet this a real African leader and his dashiki, and it was very cool for me. And then in 64, after my uncle died, and my uncle, John Kennedy, fell in love with Mboya. And he said to him, and he gave him $200,000. And he said, on the condition that Mboya not tell anybody where he got it, because my uncle was also worried about winning the South. And Nixon found out that Jack had given Mboya the money, and he then branded it publicly. Oh, this is the Kennedy airlift. He's bringing Africans over, to the United States. When probably he thought we should be sending, blacks back to Africa, at that point. In 64, my uncle died 63. In 64, my uncle Sarge Schreiber, who had started the Peace Corps under, JFK and was still running it under LBJ, took me and my cousin Bobby Schreiber, who was my best friend and, the same age as me, to Africa for about 3 weeks. And we spent a lot of time with Tom Mboya. And then in June of 68, my father was killed. And my mother had at that point 10 kids with another one on the way. And she needed to get us, the older ones, out of the house for this summer so that she could get, some control over her life and figure out, what she was going to do. And so she sent my brother David went out to work for Cesar Chavez for the summer out in Delano. My sister Kathleen went to work for the Inuit Indians in Alaska. My brother Joe went with Everest climber Jim Whitaker, who'd been one of my father's best friends, to be a guide on Mount Rainier. And I was sent to Africa for the summer. And I spent a lot of that summer with Tom Mboya. And then I came home in August. The following September, Mboya, who was next in line to run Kenya after Kenyatta, passed, he was assassinated. Oh, he was murdered probably by Daniel Arap Moi, who eventually replaced Kenyatta. And in scroll forward to 2004, I was living with Larry David in Martha's Vineyard. Larry later introduced me to my wife, Cheryl Hines. But at that point, we were living together in Martha's Vineyard. And I was asked by the Democratic Convention in 2004, was in Boston, and the DNC asked me to come and deliver one of the keynote address on the environment. So Larry said he'd fly up with me, and we flew up in his plane. And I gave, my speech. But when we were in the green room, we met this young Illinois senator who had just been elected. No, I had never heard of him. He had a funny name, and he was going to do a speech after me. And he went, and it was Barack Obama, of course, and he went and did this speech that just blew the roof off the convention and teed him up for his run 4 years later. Made everybody in the Democratic Party fall in love with him. But we spent a lot of time with him at the convention that day. We had floor passes, so it was really fun. We got to go on the floor into all of the, into all of the green rooms, etc. But we talked a lot to Obama, and he said that he was going to Martha's Vineyard that night. So we agreed to eat dinner with him. He was going down to raise money in Oaks Bluffs, and we had dinner with him. And so I sat next to him at dinner, and I had never heard of it, didn't know anything about him. And I started asking him about his background, and he said that his father had been Kenyan. And I said to him, what tribe do you know what tribe he was from? And he said, yeah, he was Luau. And I said, oh, have you ever heard of Tom Mboya? And he said to me, Tom Mboya is the reason I'm over in this country, because his father was the first student brought over on the Kennedy airlift. That was, just sort of an amazing experience that came out of my uncle's, just a love and affinity for nationalism in Africa and for nationalist movements everywhere.
Right. And I don't think that this is just the grist for the mill of like historical nostalgia. These issues are actually very extremely relevant to today, because my assessment of your father and your uncle is that they were genuinely committed to third world nationalism and to internationalism, just the idea that nations should be able to cooperate with each other and peacefully and to the benefit of each other. But what emerges is instead what other people, I think, had in mind. So I think that there was even the people that were political enemies of the Kennedys still wanted the idea out there that the U.S. was promoting prosperity in the third world and such, because they needed people to believe that. But I think that they were going for something like really what Kwame Nkrumah called neocolonialism. I think that he understood this pretty well. He wrote the book on it, and then after he wrote the book on neocolonialism, they deposed him in what seems to be a CIA-backed coup, 1964, one of many coups that follow the removal of John Kennedy as president. It's really something when you look at the timing. Indonesia, Brazil, Ghana. But
I,
today 9 million people a year die in the global south from poverty and malnutrition and starvation and lack of access to medical care. The US crushes systems that try to provide these things today. So how does this is how can the US role in the world change to get back to supporting countries?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we have now, what we've had since World War II, which was unintentional to FDR, people like my uncle is a kind of soft colonialism, where that spares the occupying nation the difficulties of actually managing local economies and putting local leaderships and military protection in place, and just but allows us an opening to exploit the resources of that nation, and through a systems of military support for tin horn dictators, and then these deals with local oligarchs where they get included, and they get some to skim off some of the big money deals when the U.S. multinationals come in and liquidate all of their the nation's assets for cash. And it's this kind of corrupt bargain. But you mentioned Nkrumah. My uncle Nkrumah was an avowed Marxist, and my uncle had a talk with him one time where my uncle said to him, we don't care if you're Marxist or Leninist or whatever you are, as long as you're not a base for Soviet expansion, you should make your own choice about what you need to do with your country. That's up to you. It's not up to the United States. And if you avoid being that, base for Soviet expansion, we're going to have a friendly relationship with you. The CIA ultimately, the CIA has been involved in something like 80 coups between 1947 and 1997, about a third of the nations in the world. And that's how it enforces this system of soft colonialism. You mentioned Indonesia. My uncle, Sukarno, Ahmad Sukarno, who was the liberator of Indonesia, the CIA tried to kill him, and I think, as I recall, they shot down one of the CIA planes and captured one of them, so they couldn't deny it. And he became one of these, he became kind of one of the most vocal critics of the United States. And my uncle was talking to, I think it was a reporter one day, who was asking, what are we going to do about Nkrumah, about Sukarno? My uncle was saying, we're not going to do anything about Sukarno. And he said, and by the way, everybody tags Sukarno with being anti-American, but I'd be anti-American too if the CIA tried to kill me. Sukarno read that interview and was so grateful to my uncle that he contacted him and asked him to come to Indonesia. And my uncle actually really wanted to come to Indonesia. And he said, we're going to have the biggest celebration in the history of our islands if you come here. But my father did make two trips there, one during the Kennedy administration, and then another one afterwards. Really, LBJ did something very nice when my father was totally shattered after my uncle's murder. LBJ sent him on a diplomatic mission to avert a war between the Netherlands and Indonesia. And my uncle and my father successfully did that. He negotiated a peace between Sukarno and the government of the Netherlands. But his first trip over there during the Kennedy administration, my mother went with him, and they spent a couple of days at Sukarno's palace. And they told him that I was interested in Komodo dragons, which I was obsessed with at that time. And he sent back two Komodo dragons, which came to my house, but then they were, they could have eaten any of us, so we sent them to the National Zoo. He also gave my father a tiger, stuffed tiger that he had shot on the island of Sumatra, Sumatran tiger, that I've had since I was a little kid. My father gave it to me when he came home, and it's an endangered species, so I don't show it to anybody because it's kind of weird that I have a stuffed endangered species in my office. But I'll show you a tiger.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
But
Yeah,
that was shot by a Sukarno.
yeah, I'm very familiar with that Sukarno tale and all. I've actually done hours and hours of material on Sukarno in Indonesia and specifically the JFK policies. They were Sukarno said to someone that he believes that he thought that Kennedy was killed because he was trying to stop confrontazi, the Malaysian crisis that they had. I wouldn't say that that's an accurate assessment, but I think from his perspective, he knew that Indonesia was a prize at that moment, and so.
Yeah, everybody wanted the Congo and everybody wanted Indonesia.
And
And
your father, your uncle, with that Solomon Island story, I wonder if that had a. There's a book by an Australian historian named Greg Polgrain where he says he talked to Dag Hammarskjöld's right hand man, who revealed that Dag Hammarskjöld was being used by JFK as a stalking horse, basically, to allow for the UN to manage West Papuan independence. But by when Dag Hammarskjöld gets killed, they can't do that, and because of Cold War calculations, JFK has to abandon that, and so West Papua gets absorbed by Indonesia. But there was so much at stake there, and it's like it takes decades to learn even what was really going on.
you know, it's the two guys who rescued my uncle during the when he was elected president. He sent a message to the Solomon Island. It was a protectorate of Great Britain at that time, and he said he wanted them to come to his inauguration. He also, incidentally, he brought the admiral of the who was the captain of the battleship. He was by that an admiral, and it cut his ship in two and sunk him. And he invited that guy who I met at his inauguration. We were very excited to meet him because he was the guy who sank, Uncle Jack's ship. But he also was really excited about having the two Solomon Islanders who had saved his life come to his inauguration. But the British governor of the Solomon Islands was embarrassed because these guys, didn't own shoes and they could not speak English. So he picked two Solomon Islanders who were more presentable, who were more civilized, and he sent them instead, thinking that would fool my uncle or assuage him or something. And my uncle was so angry at them at that point. But years later, maybe about 10 years ago, my brother went to the Solomon Islands. My little brother Max went to the Solomon Islands with Bob Ballard, with what is Ballard's first name? The explorer. Is it Robert Ballard? I think it's Robert Ballard. But anyway, he went there with him to find the PT 109, and they did a diving expedition, and they went down with deep water submersibles, and they found an engine block that they thought was the remains of PT 109. But at that point, my brother ran into the two Solomon Islanders, and one of them was wearing a T-shirt that said "I saved JFK." And when he saw Max, he just burst into tears, and he kissed him all over, and he was just weeping and weeping, and just this very, very kind of emotional reunion. It was really beautiful.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's amazing. I mean, this I think that your uncle had an understanding of war that you don't find in people of that era, because he was there not as an officer, so he was actually involved in the combat. And people criticize JFK for policies of the US, and it's not as though all the imperial chicanery stopped under his watch at all by any means. I mean, you have things like Operation Mongoose and even propping up the South Vietnamese government, whose legitimacy was very dubious in the first place. But there was an attempt to avoid war, and as you say, you listed in the beginning, every time that there was a question of hot war, he avoided it. Laos, Berlin, Vietnam really multiple times, Cuba multiple times, and this I do think is worth looking at and thinking about. But now in 2023, and it's we have enough history to understand the political parties in the U.S. I was growing up in Indiana, and my mom was a Democratic congressional staffer. I worked for the Democrats in 2004, and I was on the Obama campaign staff in 2008. I went to the inauguration and the staff ball, even. But when Obama ended up carrying out many of the George Bush policies and ended up saying we should look forward and not back when it came to crimes like torture and illegal war, it really disillusioned me. And oddly enough, or interestingly enough, at Oliver Stone's recommendation, I read the book JFK and the Unspeakable, and this radicalized me more, not because of I thought that one person is really a key, the key to understanding U.S. history, but it's not. It's that all that it revealed about the history before and what followed was really illuminating. So this really radicalized me, and I watched the Democratic Party orchestrate two primaries that were farcical, I thought, in which they just destroyed Bernie Sanders to ensure that you would get a more corporate and pro-empire candidate. So how do you respond to those who say that reforming the Democrats is just not, and the Democratic Party is just not feasible? That it's almost like, I don't want to say reforming the mafia from the inside, but it's a difficult thing to even imagine how it could be done. How do you think that it can be done?
Well, I mean, the only way it's going to be done is, I mean, if I get in there and if I can somehow get through, run all those traps and get in there, then I can. That's one of the few organizations that is you reform from the top down, because it's corrupt from the top down. The Democratic Party is not corrupt. It's the party organization, and the president has the ability as leader of the party to change that. If Bernie Sanders had gotten in there, Bernie Sanders could have won. And he may have won last time, but he dropped out in kind of a weird way. So if Bernie Sanders had won and he had become president, the DNC would no longer be that, corrupt organization that it is now.
So there's a guy here that I'm going to quote who I don't normally have an affinity for, but I think it may be relevant, and that is Winston Churchill, who said that Americans will always do the right thing when they've exhausted every other option. And to me, I think that is relevant because it's to you and to this particular moment, because the U.S. ran the empire, and a lot of people made ridiculous amounts of money. It's the richest empire in world history, the most powerful empire in world history. And it, oddly enough, doesn't even call itself an empire. But all empires go the way of all empires. And I mean, is there more of an opportunity now, because we actually can't keep doing what we've been doing? And so which direction do we go? I see this as either the U.S. becomes more authoritarian and kind of delegitimizes its whole mythology of freedom and liberty and so on, or the U.S. takes an honest look at itself and maybe an honest look at its history, and then tries to reform its institutions. But do you feel that this creates an opportunity? The fact that it actually can't go on, that we seem to be headed for there's a catastrophe unfolding in Ukraine that has American fingerprints all over it. And I mean, I know that the Putin invasion of Ukraine is of dubious legality, but the sovereignty of Ukraine after 2014 is also debatable. And international law is not really able to deal with these sorts of issues where there's threats on a border of a great power like this. How do all these things that are happening now and the rise of China giving countries another place to turn rather than American, the IMF and so on. There's going to be even more of this, more trade conducted outside of the dollar. I mean, how does the strength or weakness of the U.S. empire impact your calculations here?
Well, I think the empire has collapsed, and thanks to the neocons and thanks to in the end of every empire, David Kennedy or Paul Kennedy, who's the Yale historian, no relationship to me or to my family, but he wrote the sort of definitive book on the decline and fall of empires, and he looked at all the empires in the last 500 years, and every one of them collapsed for the same reason, which is the overextension of the military, and which hollowed out the economies at home. And we are at the fin de cycle, the end of the cycle with the U.S. empire, and the sign of that is the Saudi Arabian defection to make an independent peace, a separate peace with Iran, orchestrated by the Chinese. And Saudi Arabia was the keystone to our entire defense strategy. We were going to create the Shia Crescent with Saudi, the Emirates, Oman, Abu Dhabi, Lebanon, Jordan, all the way up to Syria, had this kind of Syria Shia Crescent that would contain Iranian expansion in the region. And then the Saudis just walked away from it. They took away the keystone. We've spent $1.1 billion a year for the past decade. If you include the Homeland Security at home, because we spent about 8.4 billion on our military, but we also then the Homeland Security costs us. If you add that together, it's 1.1 trillion a year. We wouldn't need that Homeland Security if we weren't, bombing Iran and stationing troops in Mecca and doing or bombing Iraq, etc. Oh, that's what it's cost us. That's and the middle class has shouldered that burden. While we spend 8.1 trillion bombing ports and roads and universities and hospitals all over the Middle East and Iraq and Syria, etc.